the issue of gender and safety in male-dominated industries, and particularly in mining. What I want to do today is talk through, or eventually get to the point of showing 3 examples of the work that I do in this space. But before that, to sort of build a picture of where this has come from and show a bit of a background. I was in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago giving a talk to the Global Affairs at the Government of Canada, and I recognized as I was preparing that presentation, and equally as I was preparing this one, that I've come to a bit of a conclusion in my work that helps me really understand why it is that I push the idea that there is a link between gender and safety, and that this is really important to recognize and work with if we are to ever have any success in terms of bringing more women successfully into the workforce and enabling women to have equal economic opportunities as men do. Now, I'm often criticized, sorry, I'm just gonna, my screen for some reason doesn't seem to be allowing me to, oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm often criticized, I think, or challenged for my views which talk about women in mining in particular, or women in the workforce. And I want to make it clear, and I have made this clear so many times, but it seems to keep backfiring on me, and maybe it's, you know, I'm not explaining it well enough, but the idea that women should have equal opportunities and should be able to work in all industries, in all roles, in all contexts, to me is obvious. There is nothing that should prevent that, and we know that things prevent it, and lots of people are working in different ways to bring down the barriers that prevent women from participating in the workforce. The way that I address it has come very much from my background. My academic background is from women's studies, gender studies, feminist studies. And it has always appeared unusual to me that we have an argument that women should be allowed to go into workspaces, that we are not talking about the gender cultures so much of those workspaces, and how the systems themselves are what prevent women from being successful within those places. So over time, I've come to the conclusion that gender equality is unachievable within this liberal feminist practice of bringing women into the status quo of resource extraction. And by that, I mean the liberal feminist practice is, it's basically the idea that you give women access to spaces where men are already dominant without changing the space at all, and that women can be successful in those spaces. And I don't see this happening. And I think the numbers of women, particularly in mining, tell us this. And I was sort of further convinced of this about 2 months ago when I got a call from a very large global mining company that I have done work with in the past, and they said to me, Dean, we've done everything we can to get and keep women in the workforce. And I know they have. I know the work that they've been doing. They've looked at retention, they've looked at entry pathways, they've looked at supporting education for girls in non-traditional disciplines. And they can get some women in, but they can't keep them. The women don't stay. This is the problem they're facing. And they've done some research, and they said to me, one of the key things that's coming out is that the women are saying, we don't like the workplace culture. They've done all they can do, all they need to do to get in, but once they're in, they just don't like it. And so I'm convinced that, and I think I have been working in this space and been writing in it for a number of years, and it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that we really need to change how we understand and how we work with gender when we're looking at bringing women into industries like mining. So these are the numbers. I mean, these are just 2 countries, and the numbers change from time to time. But if you look at the Australian context, one of the oldest reports that was written on women in mining dates back to 1998. And so in almost 20 years, there's been almost 3% increase in the number of women in mining. And there's been an enormous amount of effort put into bringing women in mining, and equally so in Canada. And we find in other countries that these numbers go up and down a little bit, but in terms of the the span of the time that this work has been going on, we really haven't made that much improvement in terms of access overall. The idea as well that also women don't work in mining or haven't worked in mining is an absolute myth. Women throughout the globe, there are many women that do work in mining, in artisanal mining in particular. It is often dominated in many countries by women. And we can look historically that women have played a role in mining in many countries throughout the world. But I see that today our problem is not a problem of women. The problem is the workplace culture. So this is where I become critical of reports like this report from the Australian Human Rights Commission, which looked at women in male-dominated industries. And the report summarized a lot of the work that mining companies were doing, but failed to really challenge the masculinized workplace structures that prevent women from entering, make it difficult for women when they are there. And I think that that is a real failure on the part of people that are working in the industry to bring women in, that we're not pushing to challenge those masculine barriers. And that what happens is that we keep continuing to look at women as the problem. And so women are the thing that we need to sort out. Women are the thing that we need to assist. And I don't see it that way. I see that that further isolates or marginalizes women, and that it distracts us from really looking at the gender culture and of the workplace itself, but also the wider industry. So this is why I've come to the conclusion, and I don't think it's a sort of a new conclusion for me. I can sort of recall when this was very early on in my work in this field, starting in about 2006, that it's only achievable. We can only get gender equality in the mining industry if we really tackle and change the masculine culture. And I want to emphasize that this is not just an academic position, and this is why I want to show you 3 of the work projects that I've been involved in that do take a different approach to ensuring that women can have equal opportunities on mine sites. I go back to my early days. Now, so when I first started talking about this, giving my early presentations, I was labeled once, I think it was in the Star Observer and in the Toronto paper, that I was labeled as the gender man in mining because I seemed to be the only man talking about gender at that point. But I remember having an early presentation to a large mining company at one of their annual conferences, and I introduced the idea of hypermasculinity. And I put this term into one of their reports as well, and they were fascinated by it. I was interested in how interested they were in discussing this issue. And so I tried to explain in this conference that hypermasculinity is about this kind of stoic, strong, dominant kind of masculinity that is often still seen as the ideal kind of masculinity in many cultures. And then I showed this slide. Believe me, I had this slide on display at a mining conference, I think it was around 2008, 2009. And I started to speak about the significant changes in masculinity that had come about, not just recently in the kind of last 20 years, but more so post Second World War. And this idea of masculine bodies being now able to be gazed upon as traditionally women's bodies had been gazed upon. But I linked this, my point was to link this to safety, because what I wanted to show was that for men in particular, it's often that safety, or the discourse of safety, is interpreted as if they need protection, as if they need to be looked after. And this goes against that hypermasculinity that is still very dominant, particularly in industries like mining. So there was a disjunct between what the safety kind of policies and procedures and communications were saying, and how men who need to maintain a particular form of masculinity were interpreting those messages and policies. So I developed or started to participate in what was then a very minor debate around linking gender and safety in the workplaces. And this is where the term gender smart safety comes from. It is about recognizing that gender does impact on our understandings of safety and our practices of safety. And so I started exploring this in mining itself, and this is one of my earlier pieces of work. So this is one of the examples of how I've started to look at the gender culture of mining as a way of addressing inequities in mining. So back in 2010 or 11, I think it was, I was engaged by the Department of Mines and Petroleum in Western Australia to run a road show looking at the issue of toughness in the workplace and how toughness impacted on people's safe risk-taking behaviour. And we travelled all around Western Australia to the major mining hubs and invited people from different mining companies to come and participate in these workshops. And throughout the state, we had about 400 people, men and women, turn up to participate in these workshops to explore their ideas of how their gender culture in their workplaces was impacting on risk-taking behaviours. And some of the ideas that came out of this linked very much to broader understandings that I'd already had around masculinity. Is this link between, in many cultures, in order to be seen as a real man, that risk-taking becomes an important part of showing that, because by risk-taking, if you survive the risk-taking, you become the hero. So that men are expected to show strength and toughness, and this then becomes very difficult when we're telling them that they also need to be taken care of or take care of themselves in the workplace. And I saw this, as I continued to do this work, I saw it time and time again, example after example, of men taking risks in the workplace, and in the post, if there was a safety incident, in the interview afterwards, there would be some reference to not wanting to be seen to be weak, or not wanting colleagues to see that I was incapable of doing a job. So I pushed beyond the limits of what was safe. Many times this works out, and this is how men become heroic, and they start to then see this as a necessary path. Risk-taking is a necessary path, a necessary way of showing that they are real men. External studies have looked at this too, more recently as well, in a number of different areas. There is work being done in Scandinavia that looks at behaviors of men in male-dominated industries like oil and gas. There's a particular couple of academics in Sweden who look at the oil and gas industry. It's been looked in terms of driving behaviors for men, also for young men. There's been a lot of research looking at the risk-taking that young men do. There was a really large study done in Canberra a few years ago, about 5 years ago now, that found that the majority of young men drive in excess of the speed limit because they are concerned that if they drive to the speed limit or under the speed limit, they will be laughed at by their peers. And so that not taking risk contributes to demasculinizing them, and it is very important for them to hold on to that sense of masculinity. And then this is an example of how I put this into practice as well in a workplace. This was actually a construction site, and I did a gender smart safety audit of that construction site. And we saw a number of examples of men taking risks, and clearly taking risks because of their sense of being invincible and being extremely powerful. So the first example here is the employee carrying the bucket of hot asphalt or bitumen. And when we asked him why he wasn't wearing gloves, now this is safety 101, but he wasn't wearing gloves. And when we asked him why he wasn't wearing gloves, he said that his hands were hardened and tough enough to withstand the heat. That is physiologically impossible. If the asphalt had if it had covered his hands would have been burnt, but he had this sense that he was strong enough to withstand that if it happened. The second example I have here is work that I've been doing. It started off in Papua New Guinea, and you see the picture here of the team that I worked with there. And this was, it's an ongoing piece of work, but it's a very innovative way of looking at women's safety, the worksite safety in male-dominated industries. And so with this team and with 3 companies in Papua New Guinea, we developed a workplace women's safety audit method, very much tied to international standards around safety auditing, but also recognizing that women's safety on work sites can often be very different. They can face very different risks because of the tasks that they are doing that are distinct from the tasks that men are doing, but also because of particular risks that women might face. I worked very closely with an oil and gas company, with a mining company, and with an agricultural company to develop, pilot, and run these initial women's safety audits. And these companies are now running these internally themselves and measuring their results over time. And they've had some of them have had really, really quick wins. I mean, we found in one of in the mine site that there was the women were at risk of emotion. It was emotional safety we were looking at as well. They were at risk because of the fear of going into certain areas of the mine site to clean the buildings, because they were often being accosted by men in those areas, and they were pretty dark. So the response was to put some lighting in, to put some signage up, and to make sure that they increased awareness of respectable behaviors in the workplace. That is one of the quick win examples that they were able to take. And the reason why I do this links to also understandings of how women are constructed through risk, but it's also almost the opposite of men. That we often assume that women are not doing risky jobs, and this was the case on the mine site in Papua New Guinea. The assumption had been made that the cleaners didn't really face any significant risks, not like the people who are using the machinery. So the safety audits that they already had in place were focusing on the machinery use and that operations side of mining, but not the support services. And the women, what I remember when we used one of the tools with a group of women to gather information on their safety. And one of the women said, "No one's ever asked me about my safety on this work site." And she'd worked there for many years. She was a cleaner, and there was the assumption that she was in a very safe, risk-free job. She was using chemicals. She was using chemicals in not very safe ways, as were her co-workers, and that was very clear. That was another outcome of the audit. Women tend to be involved a lot more in repetitive work as well. We find this in other industries where I work, like the garment sector. It is a lot of repetitive work, and so this has particular safety risks for women in the workplace. There are also the physiological differences between men's bodies and women's bodies. So women who are pregnant and still at work, often we find that safety policies, safety audits don't take that into account. They don't recognize that women's bodies go through different changes to men. And if we look historically, and I have done this, that the whole discourse of safety, of workplace safety, comes out within a context where only men, were able to work in industry. And so how we understand safety and the way we've written safety procedures and policies are very much designed for the male worker, and they haven't necessarily been adapted. There's also evidence to suggest that the way that we have constructed machinery, there is a book, and I can't recall the author at the moment, but she's done a kind of a gender analysis of machinery in the workplace. And she talks about shows examples of how machinery was purposely constructed to ensure that it could only be worked by very, very strong bodies, used by very, very strong bodies. The idea being that this would prevent women from accessing those particular points of those jobs. But we do now have women using machinery in industries like mining, and again, the safety policies and procedures haven't necessarily adapted. So when we did the gender smart safety audit in Papua New Guinea, and this is a combination of all the results of all the audits that we've done so far in that country, we find issues of safety when being transported to and from work, sometimes in company provided buses or vehicles. We find that there is a low level of anti-harassment training and a high level of women recognizing that their career has been impacted because of a safety concern. This is they themselves have either said, I won't go to that location or I won't do that job because I don't feel safe, or somebody else has made that decision for them without asking them. This is an overview of the method that we use in that workplace women's safety audit. and it uses a number of tools, looking at physical safety, looking at emotional safety, and also looking at occupational safety. And in this picture, a lot of the women are also members of the community, local communities in Papua New Guinea. They have important roles in the community. So we do a lot of the work in the community as well. And the important point here as well is that traditional safety audits focus very clearly on physical safety, often miss some aspects of emotional safety, though we are seeing an increase in that in industries like mining, where we're paying attention to worker well-being. But occupational safety is one that is very much absent in traditional safety audits. And occupational safety is very much a safety that affects women, that they don't feel secure in their jobs. We know from the statistics that women are often the first ones to go, to be let go when there is a downturn in the economy, and they suffer from that downturn, and so economic vulnerability, and also occupational safety in the sense that a lot of women who go into senior positions find it very difficult for men who are junior to them to respond to their requests or their way of working, that often there is a resistance to having a female boss still. Now, I find this very, very strange and very unusual in terms of the way that I've been brought up in my experiences, but it is very clear from the work that I do that we do find a lot of women who still experience this. And then more recently, this is the work that I've been doing, is expanding this, how we understand safety through gender. So it is not just about physical safety or emotional safety in the workplace, it can also be linked to outside of the workplace. And we're now doing a lot of work around this. So it comes under the umbrella of gender-based violence or violence against women. The two terms are sometimes used interchangeably, though some people would argue that is incorrect. And some of the workplace issues that I look at in my work around safety is sexual harassment, which affects women a lot more than men in a workplace, and bullying as well, which in the mining industry can affect both men and women. And I have been involved in many examples of responding to male-male bullying on mine sites. And employers are starting to understand that very clearly as workplace issues that they need to address. In some countries, it's now becoming a legal requirement to provide mitigation activities against the risk of sexual harassment. Some of the things that go further away from the workplace but do have an impact on employees in the workplace are to do with domestic violence, which also includes violence between intimate partners and family sexual violence. And the idea that, it's not an idea, sorry, that the statistics that clearly show that this is more of a risk to women than it is to men. And therefore, because women are experiencing domestic violence more, they are less able to fully participate in the workforce. They take days off, they have to seek medical assistance, they may not be able to put in as much effort to get the promotions that they are capable of getting because they are dealing with these issues in the domestic space. And then one that goes even further is this issue of sexual exploitation and abuse in communities. And this is a very newish area in terms of talking about violence that impacts on women and prevents them from participating fully in the workforce. But it is something that is now, we're currently working on projects. I'm about to start working, going out to Cameroon and Egypt in around September to work with employers on how they can look at this issue of sexual exploitation and its impacts on their female employees. So in terms of where I'm at with my work and where I'm going, I still think there's some gaps in the mining industry in particular around gender issues. I still find that when I talk to a lot of people who work in the mining industry, their understanding of gender is man versus woman. And so that binary is still very dominant. But my work comes more from a position of explaining how we practice and do gender rather than that we are gender. I see that there's still a lot of resistance to change within mining companies. This comes not just from employees, male employees, it comes from right across the spectrum. That there are certain gender norms or norms of gender that are approved in the companies, and I I meet some women who are very happy with that because that is also the gender that they like to do, and they feel very comfortable. But equally, I meet a lot of women and some men who are not comfortable with it, and I've had experiences of men in particular having breaking down and clearly in need of counselling because of the gender norms that they are trying to emulate through their work, but are finding it very, very difficult. And then there's some of the hidden problems that I think mining will have to face over the next few years. And one in particular, this is what I have written a chapter in my new book now on the issue of sexual exploitation linked to communities where there are mining operations. And this is very much something that is impacting on mining operations in Canada and also in the US, as well as globally. But there are specific issues also linked to Indigenous communities where we're seeing exploitation on the part of people who are connected to the mine sites. But opportunities, I see that we have opportunities for diversity in the work, and I think this is where I'm starting to be a little bit more appreciative as well of the work that people do around retention, trying to get women, give them access through employment opportunities into the workforce. It's not what I do, but if it's what they do, and our goal is the same, which is to give women more opportunities in mining, then we can try to work together. And hopefully I'm learning to do that a little bit better. One of the opportunities I had in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago was to facilitate a workshop between mining companies and NGOs. Now, the non-government organizations, these two groups tend to have very, very different ideas about gender, very different ideas about the environment, very different ideas about the legal aspects and so on. So they very often do not work together. And I've seen through facilitating that workshop that there are opportunities now for mining companies and NGOs in Canada to work together. And I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes. I'm still interested in academic ideas. I am not an academic. I have no desire to work as an academic, but I'm very interested in academic understandings of mining, both as a practice, but also as something that is important to human civilization. And so I continue to try and bring those together through my work to make sure that academic ideas inform the work that I do. I think there's a lot of room for looking at cultural differences, the connections or between gender and ethnicity and religion, and that certainly comes out a lot in my work outside of mining, and has to, because I'm often working in very different ethnic contexts. But I've seen a little bit of it happening in mining, but I don't think it's as overt as it can be, and I think there's an opportunity there. And the last one is this ecofeminism. And again, ecofeminism is a broad term, and it includes the word feminism that often people are very scared of. But it is, I'm interested, there's a lot of work going on in Scandinavia to look at the possibility of practicing mining in eco-feminist ways. And this means bringing in kind of different ways of understanding and doing mining that is linked to an appreciation of the land, but is also has a different structure within businesses. In terms of the hierarchy is broken down, there is more communal decision making, there is more respect for diversity within people, for people to do different jobs and so on. And so I'm interested in the impact that that may have on the gender culture within the industry. And so in conclusion, and this is what I think I've known all along, but I'm slowly come to realize myself and be able to articulate a little bit better, that this practice that we have of extracting resources, this practice of mining, it absolutely needs a different model of gender through which to work. And that it cannot survive as this hypermasculine space in which a few women are afforded what are often temporary equal opportunities. It has to be the gender culture of the mining industry has to be challenged to the point that we're not even talking about women being offered or afforded equal opportunities. It should become absolutely normal and natural for women to have equal opportunities and to be able to stay and contribute to the companies that employ them, and to enjoy long and profitable and enjoyable careers without having to face some of the significant issues like the ignoring of their safety or the harassment and the violence that often occurs, that I find in my work often occurs in the workplaces. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Dean, for a very informative and very interesting presentation. Certainly, as you have said, there's been so much work put into gender equity and attracting more women to work in the mining sector, and it's taking a long time to move the needle. And I think your presentation certainly hit on some very important reasons why that needle's not moving as quickly as some may like to see it move. So we open now to questions. If you do have a question, please type it into the box, the text box on the right-hand side of your browser, and we'll be able to ask questions to Dean based on what comes in. I'm just going to start off, Dean, with a question about what, if you've seen differences, especially in the work that you're doing in the more developing countries, if you've seen differences between when a global employer brings in this gender audit and the desire to make changes from a gender equity point of view at the workplace, and when that that's driven by the local employer. Is there a difference in how the ideas and the concepts are received, or have you seen it be a bit more equal?
Well, I think, I mean, in my experience, there are very clear differences, and it's not. But I think the differences are not necessarily between where the employer is coming from, where they're local or coming from outside. It is very much about the understandings of gender of the employees, because if you're going to be doing an audit on gender issues, whether it is gender equity or gender-based violence, sexual harassment, family sexual health, for example, if you're going to be doing that kind of audit, and we've just completed a large one with the International Labour Organization in Myanmar, one of the things that we found there, and I've found in other places, is that these concepts of gender that I know from my cultural background are very, very alien to them. And it is not just that they don't recognize them, or that they haven't, they don't see sexual harassment as sexual harassment. It is that the cultural position that they come from is extremely different to where I come from. So the initial work to make that audit really successful has to be about mutual exchange of ideas, so that I can understand their context in more detail and they can understand where I'm coming from. And once we have that mutual understanding, then we can start to do an audit around, a gender audit around the issues that are important to them.
Great. Yeah, that's very interesting. We've had a question come in from one of our listeners. As a woman who's worked in the mining for 13 years, our listener says she agrees that culture needs to change. What are your thoughts on subtle sexism and microaggressions in mining?
I mean, my thoughts are, I'm not sure what, in terms of my thinking about it, I don't like the idea that it happens, but I know that it happens, and I see it all the time. I see it at every level of all workplaces, where, from manager to the shop floor, and particularly in mining, I see that there is, even in mining companies and in some of the bigger ones that have very, very clear policies around sexism and harassment and microbullying and so on, and they have really strong programs around respectful workplaces and respectable behaviors. They have code of conducts for all of this. I still see it at the low level, and I think the reason why it's happening is we still have this culture of accepting that men need to compete against each other, and sexism is part of that. Sexism is also part of the way that we maintain gender inequalities within our cultures, because it is a way of subordinating women. So I think it's very difficult to change that behavior, but I think from the conversations I've had, particularly with this one large company, I think that's where the work is going to start going, and certainly that's where they're interested in looking at, is at the micro team level. Now, the work that I've done at that level is very intense, that can be really, really life-changing for men that work in teams, particularly where those teams are the team kind of spirit, if you like, or the team culture is based initially very much around denigrating others, talking about others in ways that make me feel better, trying to be more hyper-masculine than the next person, and so on. That we can see life-changing situations with very intense and very close, detailed work.
Great, excellent. Another question has come in with the comment first, great presentation, and I agree, Dean, this has been really great. What has been the best practice or practices that you have seen through the safety audits that have been successful and that you would recommend to other mining companies?
Okay, so the best ones that I've seen, actually, in terms of, if I can just, okay, the audit itself, the audit process is probably the real thing that stands out for me. To see women, and particularly in the developing context where I've done some of this work as well, to see women who have never been asked about their safety, who have never been allowed to participate in a safety audit, not just as a respondent, but I train them how to use the tools so that they can use them after I'm gone and they can continue running the safety audit. This in itself is really, I see it's really empowering for those women. They have very low literacy, often no literacy, and so we use some very simple tools that allows all women in the workforce to participate. So the process itself, I think, has been very stands out. In terms of results, I think one of the things that the women that participate in the audits really connect with is when one of the tools we use is called My World or Your World. You can use either of them. And what it does, it's a really simple tool. It's got, in the PhD context certainly, because it just has 4 faces, and it asks the women, how do you feel about your safety at home? And they draw the picture of whether they're happy and safe and or sad. How do you feel about your safety at work? How do you feel about your safety in the community? And start to have a discussion about, well, how does your safety at home impact on your feelings about safety at work? What is going on in the home that means that when you come to work you can't concentrate, or you're injured, you're physically injured, or you're worrying about something that's going on at home? And then what is it that we can feed back to your employer to help understand what they can do to help you respond to that particular issue so that your workplace is safe? And that connection is really important because, for women in particular, because still throughout the globe, women are far more active in the domestic space. The vast majority of domestic chores and childcare are the responsibility of women, and not entirely, but still overwhelmingly. And so women cannot make the separation between what goes on at home and what goes on in the workplace in a different way that often men can.
Excellent. That's a great answer. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them in the right side of your screen, and we can get to them. We still have a bit more time. Another question that's come in is kind of expanding the conversation a little bit, and we focused a lot on safety, gender safety specific to women, with workplaces becoming more inclusive and recognition of the LGBT community within our workplaces as well. Have you seen any of your work apply beyond just women, but more in the LGBT community and making sure that workplaces are safe for that community as well?
My short answer would be, unfortunately, very little. The long answer is I see the talk about it a lot. I see the talk about it in even the larger organizations, the non-government organizations and the UN departments that I work for as well. They talk about the inclusion of LGBTQI people in their work, and we talk about it in workplaces, but the end result is often that they still the people don't understand how to focus on them and what their different needs are. So there is something I always point out here, though, is that when we're talking about gender issues, the only real clear one in that acronym that can be included in that is the transgender population, the transgender persons, because that is something that is linked to gender identity and gender practices. The others are sexual identities, which of course intersect with gender identities, but sexual identity and sexual practice is often something very different. And I'm very conscious of it myself. And one of the things that I am doing, I've booked to go and do a course on integrating transgender issues more into my work, and I'll be doing that in New York in the end of July.
Excellent. Great. Well, that's interesting. It sounds like, lots of work to be done in a number of areas for sure. Another question has come in, and it is more around sharing some of progress and best practices that you may have seen working within the Canadian work environment. I know you do a lot of work globally, but have you seen changes in the Canadian workplace around gender safety, and do you think it's moving at a pace that is comparable to other industries within Canada?
So there are, let me think, there's probably three things I need to say here. One is I don't see it moving at the same pace as other countries. And certainly because I've done a lot of work before I moved to Canada as well in the Australian context, and the Australian context I think has a rougher kind of masculinity than we find in general in the Canadian context, and yet the work in Australia has moved a little bit faster in terms of recognizing the link between masculinity and risk-taking and women's safety and so on. The diversity, the Devonshire Initiative workshop that I facilitated in Ottawa, bringing mining companies and non-government organizations together, I think is really, really promising. And I do also know of, and I unfortunately I can't mention the names because the work is quite sensitive, but I do know of two Canadian mining companies that have operations in Canada and outside of Canada that are really starting to think about the impacts of their operations on sexual exploitation of young girls in the surrounding communities. This is really difficult and groundbreaking stuff. Very, very sensitive, but I see those companies doing that, and I think that's where the Canadian companies seem to be standing out more so than other companies that are still refusing to recognize the issue.
Excellent, great. We still have time for a few more questions. So as I said, if you have a question, please submit it through the question box, text box on the right side of your screen. Another question that has come in is maybe if you could expand a little bit more on what you touched on as far as the impact of these gender audits outside of the workplace, and raising awareness of gender equity and safety outside the workplace, at home or in the community, and what you've seen as kind of an effect from what you're doing with the employers within a community.
Yep. So I think one of the barriers that we first face is to convince employers that this is a business issue, and there are a lot of business cases have been done in various countries to show the impact of for example, domestic violence on businesses and how much they lose in terms of profitability and productivity because of the issue of domestic violence. Once we've got through that hurdle, I've seen so we now have a lot of companies. And mining companies. I'm working with one particular mining company which is developing this kind of response, looking at a domestic violence policy, and what they're doing is introducing separate leave days. They're not taken as vacation days, they're not taken as sick days, but if somebody is involved in a domestic violence case, and this could be both either the perpetrator or the survivor, they are entitled to take extra leave to address the problem. The company is also investing in partnering with a local organization to set up a safe house, which can be available to employees if needed for temporary accommodation. They're working with other organizations that provide counseling around domestic violence. They're doing training, obviously, to make people aware of this in their workplace. And that is I mean, this is really new and innovative stuff, I think. But that company, that particular mining company, has absolutely recognized that the one, and this is something I believe fundamentally, that you cannot have equal access for women in the workplace unless you address issues of violence, including domestic violence and sexual violence, because these impact on so much on women, more so than men. And if women are experiencing that, they just cannot come to work, and they cannot perform in a way that they're capable of doing. And what this does is then perpetuate the myth that women are incapable of doing the job that a man does because they're not at the same level. Yes, they're not at the same level because they're dealing with all of these issues out in the community and out in their home. And so to see a mining company really take this on board, I think is really inspiring, and really interested to see how that then starts to convince other mining companies in their context of why this is important.
Yeah, and I agree, and it's really great to hear that the employers are starting to really understand that connection, and hopefully we'll see more of that moving forward. Another question has come in that is looking at or asking about other industries that may have successfully or at least made bigger strides than what we have in mining so far in closing this gap. And if you're aware of these industries, what are they doing differently to close the gap?
That's interesting. I don't know globally whether there's been any kind of work to look at an industry level. On the flip side, I can say construction is the other way, right? The construction industry tends to be the one that is really lagging behind, unfortunately. There's been a lot of work done in the defense forces to address these issues, so the Army and the Navy and so on. Again, I'm not convinced that we're yet seeing evidence that it's successful in terms of changing the culture. There's been a lot of work done in the garment sector, and this is particularly in areas like Asia, Southeast Asia, where there's huge garment industries over a number of countries, where a lot of women are employed in some of those countries. In other countries, it tends to be a male-dominated industry. There's been a lot of work there. There's also agriculture. I think, again, because agricultural industries recognize, I think, more easily than say mining companies, that their women are at risk, because they know that the women are often out in the fields by themselves, and they're sort of far away from what's happening in the workspace, even though it is the workspace. They're far away from the kind of central point. And so there has been some work to look at addressing sexual harassment issues and violence issues in those areas. In terms of then women's safety and looking at safety within the workplace, I think the mining industry is probably equal in terms of where that's at right now, but it's still at a low level right across the industries. We're still working to, it's very difficult to convince people who have control of safety that they may need to start looking at safety a little bit differently. So we still got a lot of work to do there.
Excellent. That's great. Well, we are coming to the end of our questions. I think we've had a lot of great conversation, and you've shared some really informative, helpful information, and some interesting examples as well on this issue of making workplaces gender smart. So, Dean, I would like to thank you for your time. It's been a great conversation, and thank you everyone for your questions and comments, and for sharing your insight and expertise with the Ensemble Network. If you have any other questions or concerns about today's webcast that weren't answered, don't hesitate to start the conversation on Ensemble or connect to me directly. We encourage you to please stay tuned. A recording of today's webinar will be available on the Ensemble site within a few days, and I invite you to review the monthly blog post as well. So this concludes our Ensemble webcast. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and join us next month for our next Ensemble webinar. Goodbye.